Right, so I'm back in my office. I managed to finish up the roll of film as well after that particular bit of B-roll and footage at Corfe Castle. And I've taken the film out. So again, this is AGFA APX 400 film, and it took about 8 minutes to develop in my lab box. And that kind of compares to about 5 minutes that it takes for Ilford HP5 Plus normally. So obviously then I digitized the negatives when they had finished drying, and then just did a few kind of minor tweaks to get them in a finished state, so to speak. And then the digital images that I took at the same time and the same compositions the best I could, I've processed them in Lightroom as well. And then I've also used Silver FX Pro 2 and then the APX 400 kind of film type in Silver FX Pro, and then just a few more kind of tweaks on the right hand side panels and sliders in the Silver FX Pro plugin to get it to kind of, again, a finished article. And then what we'll do now is obviously I'll put up like the images that I took with the film camera without the filter, with the filter, and then the digital images, and we'll just kind of have a discussion about the results. So let's get to it. Right, so I probably arrived a little bit late to Corfe Castle that morning because it was a bit of a rush to get up to the position that I wanted to be in order to take the shots. And this is one of the first kind of shots that I took, and this one obviously was with film, and it was using actually the 135mm lens that I had. So this didn't have any filters attached to it. So it was just a pure straight out of camera, in effect, film image. And I'm not crazy about the composition. And as you can kind of see here, there's something across the frame which sticks out a little bit in the image, and the composition, yeah, it's just not particularly great. But I really did suffer all through the Corfe Castle kind of images, certainly with the film images, with flare. And this one that I took later on in the morning with the 35mm, actually the 28mm Olympus lens that I have, and you can quite clearly see here the flare that is picked up from the sun, which after all the cloud had gone, it was just kind of bright sun for the rest of the time that I was there. So this image isn't the best, but I do kind of like the flare to a point. I think it would be better without this kind of bottom part of the flare, because I quite like the way that obviously the aperture blades have created the flare, like hexagonal kind of shape in this portion of the image. Yeah, so this image was obviously taken in a rush because, as you can see here, even there's just a little bit of cloud in the sky, and I just kind of knew that that was going to go pretty quick, so I didn't film this particular composition. But as you can see as well, that this particular film, even though it's ISO 400 and I developed it at ISO 400, it just didn't really do that well. And yes, I was shooting into the sun, but it wasn't particularly bright at this point, so the camera or the film, I tend to think, really struggled with this composition. So this was taken with the 50mm lens on the Olympus, and it doesn't have a filter attached to it. The second image was with the orange filter attached, and I used the in-camera through the lens metering, so I didn't adjust any of the settings. It was in aperture priority mode, so it was just on whatever aperture I shot, probably f8, f11. It had to be quite high because obviously this camera is limited to 1/1000th of a second shutter speed, so I had to have quite a small aperture and a large kind of depth of field to have the camera operate within its limitations. So obviously from the first image, going back to it here, you can certainly see that having the orange filter attached has definitely made a good deal of difference in terms of the amount of grain in the image and that the cloud is a little bit more defined. And again, here on the left there's a little bit of flare, I believe. So the next image again is the camera metering, but this time with the red filter attached to the lens, and you'll see this probably all through the compositions that I've prepared for you today, in that I generally tend to prefer the look from the orange filter, whereas the red doesn't really seem to offer up much more benefit than that from the orange. So that's the red, just flip back to the orange, so that's the orange, and then that's the red. So you can kind of see that again there's more grain creeping into it, the flare is a little bit more pronounced, whereas the orange one, there's a little bit more contrast in the scene. Right, so then I tried and failed to use my Gaussian light meter. I've got no idea what was going wrong with that meter, because it's normally really reliable, and beyond Corf Castle, when I was using the filters and the meter, it seemed to work well, but I just, for whatever reason, I couldn't get it working on the day. So I ended up switching to use like a digital app on my phone, which I don't think really made much difference, because then at that point with the camera metering, I just left the camera in its aperture priority mode, but then when I switched to the digital app, I switched the camera up to manual mode, and then I dialed in both the aperture and the shutter speed depending on what the digital app was telling me to shoot. And for the orange filter, I dropped it back, so I told the light meter that I was shooting at ISO 200 for it to take into account the fact that it had a darker filter on the front. And then when I had the red filter attached, I told the light meter that I was shooting at ISO 100, so a two-stop kind of reduction in light. So let's have a look at those. So obviously my favorite so far is the camera metering 50mm lens orange filter. So if we look at the first one with the digital app metering, so this is with the orange filter manual mode in the camera, so you can see it's not quite as good as the actual camera metering in my opinion on this occasion. And then again with the red filter, the grain is a little bit more evident in the shot. Yeah, so this image, I just slightly adjusted my composition, because as you can see, I've still got some cloud in the sky. I didn't talk to the camera at this stage as well, because like I said, once that cloud up there was gone, that was it for the rest of the day. So I had to work quite fast. So this was 50mm no filter. The next image is the orange filter with the camera doing the metering, so back in aperture priority modes. And then this image was the red filter with the camera doing the metering again. And then this image was the orange filter with the digital app doing the metering, so the camera was in manual mode. And then again, the same with the red filter with the digital app doing the metering duties on this one for its exposure. So as you can see from this composition, there isn't much difference. And again, I think I prefer this image, which is the same as before. It's the 50mm lens, the orange filter, and then the camera in aperture priority mode. And then I've left the camera do its own through the lens metering. And that, I think, for me on this composition was the strongest image. What I'll do is I'll flag the film images that I prefer, and then when I've got the digital images later on, we can just flip back to those that it has the best shot it kind of comparing to. So let me just flag that one quickly. So the next composition where I'm going to be looking at is the one I actually talked through with you out in the field in Corf Castle earlier in this video. So back to Lightroom. So even though I've had really good success with this composition in the past because of the way that the castle is silhouetted against the landscape with that strong sun. But as you can see, the film really struggled here, and there's just so much grain for this ISO 400 film. And the film itself as well is a fresh film, so it's not expired, and it's being kept in a kind of dark, cool space. So I don't think there's anything wrong with the film, and you'll see later on it does actually produce some really good shots, well kind of exposed shots. It just didn't do a very good job here at Corf. So this was no filter, and then the second image again was, this time it was with the camera doing the metering, and this is again the 50mm lens, which I just kept on. It seemed to give me the composition that I was looking for here. And then this is, like I said, orange filter, and then the camera doing its metering in aperture priority mode, and then the same again but with the red filter. So you can actually see here the red filter does make the image a lot more akin to what I was looking for out there. It helps cut through a little bit more of the haze, a little bit more of the grain, and it does produce a reasonable image. I then did the same as before. I switched to manual mode on the camera and then used the digital app to set the exposure for an appropriate shutter and aperture based on, again, I was fighting the camera's maximum shutter speed at 1/1000 of a second in this image. And of course, for the orange filter, I was setting it to ISO 200, and the red filter, I was again setting it to ISO 100 to kind of pull it back a little bit for a longer shutter speed based on the reduced light entering the camera. So the next image is the digital app with the orange filter, again, the 50mm lens. And it's a real shame here with the flare, because I think without the flare, it definitely started to provide a bit more contrast and detail to the scene that it really needed. And again, with the red filter, with the digital app metering. And again, I think if it wasn't for the flare, this would have been a really nice image because again, in the background, like in a similar image I've managed to achieve, you get a little bit of this fingering. The sun kind of casts shadows through the haze that was around on the day down the banks of the mound that the castle is sat atop. So yeah, so I think out of these 5 images, obviously this one was the worst with no filter, and I think this one with the orange filter and the not quite so severe flare as the red filter is the better image in this case. Yeah, so what I'll move on to now as well, before we move away from the Corf Castle images, because obviously when I was down there I took some similar compositions with my digital camera like this one, and as I mentioned earlier, I basically took it into Silver Efex Pro 2. So I'll just show you quickly what I did. So ignoring the fact that I've already processed this image, but basically on the right hand side in this plugin, you basically got a number of film types that you can apply, and this one down here, AGFA APX 400, is obviously similar, or is virtually the same name of film that I've used in the film camera this time, even though it's a different kind of stock. The one that the Silver Efex Pro 2 tries to emulate is probably the original AGFA APX 400 film type, whereas the equivalent film that you can actually buy, I believe, is a more modern take on that old film stock. So yeah, so anyway, I applied the AGFA APX 400 film type to the digital images, and then, like I said, I just went through the sliders, getting it to how I want it to look, and then again applied a colour filter depending on the look that I liked that the software produced, then saved that, and that was kind of my digital image that I would then compare with the same name film type. So we'll just look at a couple compositions now from Corf before moving on. Obviously this was one of the best images, which isn't that best, that I took with the orange filter on the 50mm lens on the Olympus OM2N. So then obviously if I just set up a comparison a minute. So the digital image is obviously on the left and the film image is on the right. I wasn't particularly happy with any of the images that I took on this trip, but again it was mainly just to shoot the film that obviously I was interested because Silver FX Pro had a similar film type, and again I was also looking to try the filters to see what kind of an effect that would have and then compare that to what the image looks without any filters added to the front of the lens. So obviously this is just a bit of fun, shall we say. So obviously the digital image picks up a lot more definition, doesn't have the same amount of grain going on, even though there was a limited amount of digital grain added. So I generally think that the digital image here did a better job. So if we look at the other Corf Castle image that I took, so this time the film image with the red filter digital app metering on the left, whereas the Olympus EM1 image this time on the right. So you can see that I've managed to really quite well match the actual composition. And there's definitely, like I said earlier, it's a real shame this flare has affected this image, because I think without that, the film image could have given the digital image a real run for its money. But when I took this image, there was no cloud in the sky, so there's a serious lack of any interest in that particular sky. But I do kind of like the leveling a little bit in the distance, but obviously when I was here in October with mist around, I produced a much better composition. But again, this was just to compare the digital film image with APX 400 film and then the digital image using the APX 400 film type in Silver FX Pro 2, just for a little bit of fun. So I left Corf Castle then, obviously. I still had some film to use up, so I took it on a trip to Weymouth Bowleys, also in Dorset, where I took a couple of images again to compare the film type with the digital film type conversion. So the first one up is of a supposed abandoned campsite here in Dorset, and even though this wasn't like in the morning or in the afternoon, it was nice this time to get a little bit of interest in the skies beyond this abandoned campsite. So the digital image is on the left and the film image is on the right. So whilst the film image is obviously a lot better here than the images that I took at Corf, again, I still in this instance prefer the digital image equivalent. And again, even though I'm not completely sold on the APX 400 film type in Silver FX Pro 2 at all times, again, it's nice to have it there if it does seem to suit a particular image that I'm developing. But obviously I was interested to see how it compared with the actual film stock or the modern film stock equivalent. So here we are. One thing to note on this image though on the film is that I didn't use any filter. So it's sans filter on the film image, whereas obviously with the digital image on the left, I was able to apply a digital color filter in post to suit the look that I've achieved here. Right, so the second image that day was of this subject here, which I just absolutely love, this Art Deco style hotel in the Bowlees area. This was shot through like a glass panel that kind of separates out the swimming pools from the rest of the complex. So there is a little bit of reflection here and there with the images. But this one anyway was just a handheld shot 28mm lens on the Olympus OM2N. And what I really liked when I took these images was there were some great cloud formations in the sky. So what I actually then did was switched out to a 50mm lens, and then the next two shots I took with no filter attached and then an orange filter attached, and I let the camera do the metering. This was shot handheld, whereas the Corfe Castle images were shot on a tripod, obviously. So I might throw these images up together and then we can compare them side by side. So yeah, so I think out of all the images I've taken so far and shown, this one obviously shows the greatest difference between using a filter on the right hand side and not using a filter on the left hand side. If there's one thing I've proved in this video, is that there's definitely an advantage to using filters in the right kind of scene, because obviously the image on the right, in my opinion, is a lot stronger than the image on the left, and I'd probably have to push it a lot in post to get to a similar looking image as to one on the right, and I don't think there's probably the information there available to get such a good result as I did with using the filter on the right hand side. So obviously I took a digital image as well, so if we switch to that, right, so here we are, the film image this time is on the left, and then the digital image, which I took I think with my Olympus camera, is on the right. So again, I probably applied a red or an orange filter digitally in Sofa FX Pro 2 to achieve again the same level of contrast in again the sky and those details on the actual building itself. So even though I do prefer the digital image, the film image is still pretty good. Right, so while we're doing this comparison mode as well, before I took the film camera to Corfe, I also took it with me when I went to London at the iconic Battersea Power Station development. So I was obviously across the river. So the film image is on the left and the digital image is on the right. It's a hard one actually, because I've just pulled this up and I haven't looked yet to confirm that that is the case, but I can just tell that the right is a lot more clear and defined. So that to me, if I just show, is the one I took with the Fuji in London, whereas obviously the one on the left is with the film. And again, it was handheld and I didn't have any filters with me, so this is without filters. So that's probably why with the digital image I've been able to push it a lot further in post. But I think I almost prefer the film image in this scenario, just because it just feels a little bit more ethereal. I guess the tonality of the digital image I don't think is as strong as that film image, and generally the APX 400 film has done a good job with this scene. Obviously after my walk in Bowlees and Weymouth, I still had some more film to use up, because that's a good thing with shooting 35mm film. You do generally get 36 exposures out of a roll of film. So I then went back to my favorite kind of local spot, which is still good at the moment because spring hasn't yet sprung, so the mill itself is still kind of visible. So yeah, so this is a real interesting composition. Again, not just because I like the actual composition of the mill, but because obviously one image is film and one image is digital, and I think it's a lot less clear as perhaps in some of the images that I've shown today is which is which. And again, I had to kind of pull out the information just to remind myself which is which in this instance. And this is one where I did actually manage to get the Gaussian meter working. So the image on the left is the film image. The camera was in manual mode, had orange filter on 28mm this time. The lens to get the whole of the mill, the wheel, and then some of the surrounding scene in the image. It's a shame with the film image, and it's the same when I show you the other film images here actually, that there's a little bit of kind of damage, or where the image overexposed this portion of the scene and it's kind of spoiling it a little bit. And I did try in post obviously to try and darken that area down, but it is still quite evident that something obviously wasn't quite right. So I'm not quite sure what that was, but on the whole I'm quite pleased with how the film image turned out. And again, obviously the digital image on the right, which I think was taken with my Olympus, and again used the APX 400 film type in Silver FX Pro 2, and then in this instance an orange filter. And even though it has picked up more detail in the sky, because obviously there was probably more clouds passing at that point as opposed to when I took the image on the left. So just to finish off, we'll just flick back to the other images that I took with the film camera in this particular location. So you can look at the differences between no filter, red, orange filter, and again with the camera doing the metering, and then with this time the Gaussian meter doing its thing. Right, so the first image, as before, it Corf. This was with the 28mm lens on my Olympus OM2N film camera. The camera was doing its metering, so I was in aperture priority mode, and this time I was on a tripod and there was no filter attached. The next image, this time, was the orange filter attached to the lens, and that was the only change. The camera still did the metering. So if I just flick between no filter, orange filter, not too much difference really between no and the orange. Probably a little bit more definition of the tree on the actual building itself, and but not much difference anyway. So the next image is obviously going to be the camera metering, but this time with the red filter as opposed to the orange filter, and I think you can definitely see a lot more definition in the clouds with the red filter this time around. But again, you can see at the bottom part of the image it's kind of a bit brighter than the rest of the scene, so it's something was going on down there. Whether the camera just couldn't handle the reflection off the water and it just couldn't meter the scene correctly, I'm just guessing really. I don't really know why it has such a challenge with this particular scene. Because as opposed to Corfe Castle, because I was under a little bit of cover here, I didn't have as much difficulty achieving a reasonable aperture and shutter speed combination. So then, like I said, I managed to get the Gaussian meter working. So the next image here is with the camera in manual mode, just relying on the settings that the Gaussian meter was telling me to use based on whether I had an orange filter, so -1 stop, ISO 200, or whether I was using the red filter and then -2 stops, so using an ISO of 100 to basically filter the correct settings to the camera. So you can definitely see, like, this was the red filter with the camera doing the metering, and then this one was the orange manual mode Gaussian meter metering, and you can see it absolutely did a much better job at exposing the scene correctly, and then that rolls through as well when I switch to the red filter. Although I think whether the light was subtly different, but I do feel that the orange filter image. It's got a lot more punch, and it's probably ended up being my favourite image from this collection of images. It's just a shame about that area down there where it's kind of overly bright. And I'll just put that comparison up there. That's the orange filter with the Gaussian meter, and that's the red filter with the Gaussian meter. So you can see, even though it has picked up a lot of detail, the red filter has probably picked up a lot more detail in the background trees, the brickwork potentially in the sky. But I just think overall the orange filter image just looks a little bit more punchy, I guess, for want of a better word. Yeah, so just some final thoughts. I definitely felt that, certainly with this shot, when the Gaussian meter was working and the camera was in its manual mode, so I was relying on what the actual light meter was telling me to use to expose the scene correctly, with the orange filter, did do the best for me, certainly down at the mill. The Corf castles weren't that great anyway because of the conditions. It was extremely bright down there that day, and overall the digital did quite well as well against the film in these particular scenarios. Overall though, I'm not sure that I'm going to use this film type again. I'm not sure that it has many advantages over other film types, and certainly the ones I've used so far, like Ilford's HP5 Plus, I think has been a more versatile film. I just feel sometimes, notwithstanding this image, but certainly on the Corf images and some other images that I've used with it, they just look a little bit flatter and lacking a little bit of kind of contrast and punch compared to other film types that I've used. Yeah, so moving forward, I definitely will be using the filters again with film, because as you can see from these images, there was definitely a clear advantage with using an orange filter as opposed to using no filter. And hopefully when I can rely on the external Gaussian light meter again, like I did at the mill, and with the combination of filters, I should be able to get some really good results with it. And as I said before as well, even though the red is supposed to give a more stronger effect, certainly in the sky, and like blues darken down the skies, I felt that orange gave a more balanced look to the image. So I probably prefer that orange filter look, I think, over a pure red filter look. So if I was just to take one filter out with me, I'd probably just take the orange one, and in that way as well I don't have to compensate too much, if at all, to get a good looking image out of the camera. And as I said as well before, I do like sometimes the APX film type in Silver FX Pro 2, but I generally didn't really find that it worked that well for these particular images. Anyway, so I think that's it for this video. I definitely feel that I've hopefully achieved what I set out to achieve with this particular video, in giving APX 400 a go, having a look at how it compares to the Silver FX Pro 2 equivalent film type, and then also finally as well getting out and trying my filters for monochrome film photography and seeing how much they have an effect on your image. So yeah, so I really hope you enjoyed that video. As always, if you have any comments, please put them in the box below. But beyond that, thanks for watching. Bye for now.